Hey everybody. So today we're going to talk about the election of 1860, possibly the most divisive election in American history. Now, that Coach Boudreaux in your American history in high school might tell you that the election of 1860 started the entire Civil War and it was a statement against slavery. And that's not necessarily true. As we'll talk about, Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist. Yeah, he didn't like slavery, but he wasn't exactly for equality either. Now, that being said, there were other issues in the election besides just slavery. Now, on the other hand, you could argue that Abraham Lincoln didn't even appear on the ballot in most southern states, and the southern states felt like that a president was elected that they didn't even choose, that wasn't a representative of them, and that's what caused the secession. But anyway, let's talk about the election of 1860. Approaching the election of 1860, the Democrats were in national disarray. The Republican Party was growing. They began the campaign early by publicizing a new homestead bill. They began to employ Democrat watchers to find embarrassing news about Democratic politicians and get it to the newspapers. In 1859, the Republicans held a secret caucus of their top leadership to try and figure out who would be the best presidential candidate to hold the coalition together in the 1860 election. The problem is that there were too many hopefuls. They decided that to be fair, they would hold an election in a neutral Midwestern city that was not the home to any particular leader. They chose Chicago. The only hopeful from Illinois was some fellow named Abraham something who didn't have a prayer of getting to the nomination. The heavy hitters in the party hoped to nominate either William Seward, known as Mr. Republican of New York, or Samuel Chase of Ohio. Abraham Lincoln didn't have a very distinguished record in politics. He really was born in a log cabin, and he had served in the state legislature as a Whig and in the House of Representatives for one term. He had supported Zachary Taylor, and even though he lost the Senate bid to Stephen Douglas, he was in very good shape after the Republicans began to agree with his assessment of popular sovereignty. Lincoln had been a politician who was used to avoiding political extremes like abolitionism, nativism, or extreme free soil positions. Illinois is divided horizontally at about the middle. Both northern and southerners settled in it. Some portions of Illinois are even further south geographically and perhaps even ideologically than Richmond, Virginia. Lincoln, like Richard Nixon and Bernie Sanders, was an accomplished grassroots politician. He knew that to get anywhere in politics, you have to work to the people, to speak everywhere you can, and get recognition with individual voters, to support the party at every opportunity, and to pick up political IOUs at every opportunity. Lincoln was all over Illinois politics, and if somebody was sick and couldn't make a speaking engagement, he would volunteer to give a speech for them. If the party needed the foot soldiers, Lincoln would slog for the party, and if a baby in the state of Illinois had not been recently kissed by a Republican, Lincoln would ruthlessly root it out, find it, and kiss it. He took the deadly dull jobs that nobody else in the state party wanted. He spent several years as state party corresponding secretary. The job was boring and uneventful, but every piece of Republican correspondence that went out of the Republican Party office in Illinois had his signature on the bottom of it. Lots of people saw his name, and Lincoln also found out where the political bodies were buried, and he accumulated political points. In the Republican National Convention of 1860, people began to talk about Lincoln as a possible presidential choice for whoever won. But there was a deadlock at the beginning of the convention between three contenders, and each needed four more states to get the nomination. The holdout states were Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Vermont, and Indiana. Abolition was not so important in these states as other concerns, so they would most likely support a moderate. Lincoln would appeal to all of them. He was getting to be everyone's second choice for the Republican Party presidential candidate. Lincoln had no enemies and no political record. He had wide name recognition over the Lincoln and Douglas debates, and he wouldn't split the party. The convention dragged on, and this was bad news for the leading candidates, but very good indeed for Lincoln. Lincoln's handlers were, after all, local folks, so they volunteered to do lots of the dull stuff that has to get done at a convention, like count ballots. They took their time. Lincoln's people on the floor debated everything and took their time about it. Delay hurt Seward, who was emerging as the strongest frontrunner. Meanwhile, the Illinois Central Railroad carried Lincoln supporters in free from all over Illinois, and local party volunteers printed up bogus gallery tickets and gave them to Lincoln supporters, who waited at the door all night to get in. When the real ticket holders turned up, their seats were already taken. Lincoln supporters were also coached to cheer on cue. A stage manager in front of the stage had a red handkerchief, and when he pulled it out, the galleries would roar with applause. So when Lincoln's name was mentioned, there was a roar from the gallery, and when anyone else's name was mentioned, there was silence. Since Lincoln's people had also made the seating arrangements, pro-Lincoln delegations were seated flanking the undecided delegations. From the first ballot, Seward's support steadily eroded. On the first ballot, Seward lacked the nomination by a number of votes, but by the second, Seward garnered even less support, and Lincoln's support rose. By the third ballot, Lincoln was basically one delegation short of the nomination, and at that point, one of Lincoln's floor managers promised the Ohio delegation that if Lincoln won, Sam Chase could have any position that he wanted. Ohio changed its vote, and Lincoln won the Republican nomination. Republicans were amazed that they had nominated him. Newspapers didn't even know how to spell his name. Lincoln, who was 6'4", kind of gloomy, serious, and brooding, didn't drink, smoke, chew, or hunt. Born in Kentucky, his heroes were Henry Clay and Thomas Jefferson. In 1832, he had been a supporter of the American system, and by 1840, a Whig. He was a lawyer and made his living defending railroads and corporations. He believed that America was great because a poor man could make it here. He embraced the Free Soil Party's principles, and he also opposed universal manhood suffrage. He wanted to limit the vote to property owners regardless of their gender. Now, Lincoln had seen slavery up close and personal and was disgusted with the institution, but he was not an abolitionist. He did not believe in black equality, and he tended to support the colonization efforts. He didn't like abolitionists because he thought that they threatened the Union, and he fervently believed that the Union and the Constitution were more important than slavery. He wanted slavery limited to those states where it already existed and kept out of the territories. And he believed that if it was limited and criticized by American leaders, that the institution of slavery would gradually die a natural death. Lincoln and his handlers decided to do another log cabin-style campaign. The Republican candidate was nicknamed the Rail Splitter, and the difference between this and other campaigns in which Western artifacts were featured was that this one had actual issues: a Homestead Act, tariffs, land grant colleges, federally subsidized Western rail expansion, and slavery in the territories. So, slavery was only one of many issues in the election, and this fact makes it difficult to prove that the election of 1860 was a mandate against slavery, because slavery was only one of a series of issues supported by Republicans. When the Democratic Party met for their national convention in 1860, the party broke over the slavery question. The northern wing of the party refused to accept a pro-slavery platform. This caused the Southern Democratic delegates to bolt the convention, form a Southern Democratic Party, and nominate John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. The regular Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas of Illinois. Meanwhile, the remnants of the old Whig Party and the Southern Know-Nothings united to form the Constitutional Union Party. They were committed to reaching some acceptable compromise on slavery in order to preserve the Union. The Constitutional Unionists chose John C. Bell of Tennessee as their candidate. So, the contest in the free states was really between Lincoln and Douglas, who was by now tainted with the Kansas-Nebraska Act and popular sovereignty. In the slave states, it was between Breckinridge and Bell. Although Lincoln received only 40% of the popular vote, he led decisively in the Electoral College. The presidential election of 1860 marks the first national victory for the Republican Party. Several factors contributed to the Republican victory in all of the northern states. In the South, rumors began to spread that if Lincoln were elected, the South would have no choice but to secede. Lincoln would control patronage, and that meant that the Northerners and Northern sympathizers in the South would control the South. Southerners argued that new postmasters across the South, married to the Republican abolitionist cause, would begin to deliver abolitionist tracts, which would foment rebellion among the slaves. All sorts of wild rumors about Republicans began to spread. Republicans were secretly circulating in the South and arming slaves who would revolt on the announcement that Lincoln had won. Republican spies and saboteurs were poisoning wells across the South. Crazy stuff like that. Some Southerners argued that Lincoln was not the real problem, but that the real power behind President Lincoln, if he were elected, was Seward, no friend of the South, and who would actually control the presidency. Seward certainly hoped that this would be the case. In the North, the Republicans argued that in spite of Southern rumors, the South would be unlikely to secede because the Republicans would lack a majority in Congress. So even if they did their worst, from a Southern point of view, abolition bills or whatever would fail to pass into law. South Carolina's leadership vowed in early 1860 that if Lincoln became president, the state would secede from the Union. Southerners felt that the South could only suffer under a Republican regime hostile to Southern interests. During Buchanan's lame duck term, the South debated the question of secession. There was substantial resistance. Who would be the first? South Carolina settled that question on December 20th, 1860, when the state met in special convention and passed an ordinance of secession. But other questions remained. Was the South ready to fight to preserve its independence if it seceded? Or would it even have to? William Lloyd Garrison and many Northern radical abolitionists were perfectly willing to accept a geopolitical divorce from the sin of slavery and the South. Garrison's solution to the problem of Southern secession characterized in his statement, "Let our wayward sisters go in peace." The South was not yet united, and it was difficult for the whole South to show a united front based on Abraham Lincoln and the new Republican government might do. There was opposition to secession in most states, like northern Alabama and Mississippi, South Louisiana, and among German immigrants in Texas and in Western Virginia. And that opposition would pose sticky problems. The South needed a catalyst to get the ball rolling. South Carolina provided it when it seceded. All of the states but Texas seceded by conventions with majorities of pro-secession advocates to give an impression of more solidarity on secession than actually existed. The most uncomfortable questions were, could secession work? Did it mean war? Southerners debated these points in the spring of 1861, and the nation held its breath.